Welcome to Vox Rationis with me, Aditya Kashyap, and
Trish Karthik.
this is a podcast where we talk world issues from a student's perspective. So, as you guys may have noticed, there's one pretty salient change, and that's the fact that we are no longer recording just our audio. We are now talking to you guys on video and on Zoom. And we're really excited for this development as I feel it's going to make our podcast far more interactive and far more enjoyable for you guys. So, Trish, what's changed since our last episode?
So from the release of our last episode, Freedom of Speech, we got a lot of positive feedback. We got a lot of feedback in general, and one of the feedbacks which we got was make it a bit more interactive and make it a bit more chatty. So we thought we'll try to incorporate that in this episode. And we thought instead of you just looking at, let's say, blank screens and audio boxes, we thought why not show our faces and make it a bit more humane.
Yeah.
So we felt that we could now we also started doing certain clippings of our podcast and making reels of them and posting them on Instagram. Follow Vox Rationis podcast on Insta. The link
Sure.
is down here in the description. And we surely hope we've noticed that these reels are getting certain traction, and we surely hope to keep you guys engaged and entertained for the future.
Definitely, Trish. So, that being said, today's episode is on affirmative action and its implications on the world. A very controversial topic, no doubt, and one that's been catching the news of late. So, hope you guys enjoy. So, obviously, affirmative action has been gaining the headlines over the last week and probably even longer than that. But most of us who've been reading about it, especially from outside of the US, generally don't have much of an idea. So, Trish, could you maybe tell us a little bit about affirmative action and what it is?
Right. Affirmative action is usually used in the context of allocating resources or employment, and it's the practice or policy of favoring individuals that belong to groups that are regarded as disadvantaged or subject to discrimination. So, as currently what happened in the US, the Supreme Court said it made affirmative action unlawful, or it in that in that way it said that people from certain races or certain color cannot be favored in terms of admissions by colleges.
Yeah.
So, can you give us a brief history about affirmative action and why such a concept came into play?
Yeah, so affirmative action obviously it has quite a long history and it doesn't go far. It's not as recent as most people think about it. So affirmative action, well, really, it's the roots of where it came from. Kind of starts off with the Jim Crow era of the United States, and that was a period of time where there was rampant segregation throughout the country, and very similar to apartheid South Africa, wherein there was a huge racial divisions in the country, and there was huge racial segregation. For example, white people and black people often couldn't attend the same colleges. White kids and black kids couldn't attend the same schools. Often jobs were not allowed for certain communities. And obviously, I'm mentioning the black community, but there were far more minorities affected by this as well. And this was generally a very dark and unequal time for the United States. And this continued, only about quite recently, as about the 1950s. It was still very much in place, the 1950s and the 1960s. However, on September 24th, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson issued Executive Order 11246. And in this one, he prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin by those organizations receiving federal contracts and subcontracts. So this basically, it was started. The process was generally thought to have been started by President John F. Kennedy until he was unfortunately assassinated. But the process was in the works of sort of establishing racial unity and racial desegregation. And this, of course, the racial segregation affected not just employment, as the particular law states. It affected more institutions and especially colleges, which is what the main topic of discussion was when we talk about affirmative action. Because currently affirmative action, as seen by the Supreme Court, it affected two college institutions, the Harvard College and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And of course, in both cases, the Supreme Court ruled that affirmative action should not be taken and should not be used anymore, and race-based quotas should no longer be used in the future for college admissions. Yeah. All right, so now that we've given a bit of an explainer of what affirmative action is, um, how about we discuss what the significance of this ruling is, not just on educational institutions and beyond? So, Trish, why should we care about affirmative action, and what do you think the significance of the ruling will be on the entire country and possibly across the world?
All right. So, affirmative action, in my perspective, is basically it's a concept which tries to ensure that there's fairness of opportunity for all, and it tries to ensure that people who have been discriminated by society, or those who are marginalized, they have a chance to rise to the top and hopefully could stimulate further reforms within their community as well. So, what I just really hope one thing is that affirmative action is not just restricted to that of education, but it is from a broad spectrum. In a way, public healthcare is also an affirmative action because you're providing a service, which is you're providing a service for the poorer individual who, in a way, if it was not, if public healthcare did not exist, they would not be able to afford it. So they are technically uh, they have been economically marginalized and they're able to avail a service. And hence, I just hope that the word affirmative action does not gain a negative connotation to it because of this Supreme Court judgment. So, but in the grounds of education, which we are looking at right now, affirmative action was, in a way, I find that the maybe the way that it was implemented was perhaps, I mean, it's up to debate, but I feel that affirmative action in education is also required to an extent because only when certain communities, people, certain individuals, let's say, may come from poorer backgrounds or may come from families that have faced a bit more trauma or faced a lot more issues than someone who is of a better off family who can technically um, just focus on studies as well as balance their education and balance the sports and extracurriculars and eventually have, let's say, those who have not faced much issue comparatively. So I feel that it is really important that certain communities are provided the opportunity through, I mean, it may not be through the measure of quotas, it may not be through certain measures, but in some form or the other, I feel that it is important to ensure that such opportunities provided. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think affirmative action, it's quite a hotly contested issue, no doubt. And I've generally tried to soak myself on both sides of the argument, and I definitely do see both sides. I think on one side, um, people would say that in this particular context, we're talking about education, that the action of colleges looking at applications with a certain level of emphasis on the race of the applicant, that does have some ramifications because first and foremost, it does probably go against the concept of a meritocracy. And what I mean by this is that some people may, from some communities, they may be feeling that their application, despite it being of a very high standard, it unfortunately gets rejected by some of the elite universities of the country. And this was the main claim made against Harvard University. Of course, Harvard University is renowned, probably one of the finest institutions in the world. And this particular claim was made especially by Asian Americans. And there's quite a few statistics which are relatively damning to Harvard's process. So, of course, one which caught the headline was that, of course, if you were to rank applications based on their academic decile, or rather, if you were to rank them on a scale of 1 to 10, if someone had an academic scale of 5, they were over 20, close to 20 times less likely to get their application accepted into the college than someone who was an African American. And of course, we do understand, of course, that affirmative action, it's done in good faith. It's done, as Trishit mentioned, to support the marginalized groups who in the past may not have had the same levels of access. This does raise some questions, though, and to what extent can we start saying that this is equality of opportunity, and to what extent are we just trying to put an aggressive form of equity, wherein no longer is it about everybody getting the same level of opportunity to apply. Now it's all about we want a certain percentage of community in our college, so we will brush aside some of the best candidates. And this is what Asian Americans had actually felt, and it's quite something. It's very interesting because if we look at the statistics, for example, 53% of Asians who had heard of affirmative action thought it was a good thing, and this is as per the Pew Research Center, a very reliable polling institution. However, when these Asians were asked if the affirmative action should be used in college admission decisions, only 21% felt that race or ethnicity should be used in admission decisions. And what this means is, and of course, Asians were not the only ethnic group affected by this, even white Americans were as well. What this means is that you're sort of then not looking at the candidates, their real value, but you're really reducing them only to their race. And that's the argument which I feel one side is claiming, that you're moving away from a meritocracy and more towards this particular quota system, like Trish had mentioned. So I think now it's pertinent to ask, Trish, as you seem to support affirmative action, how do you defend against these claims when they say that you're moving far away from meritocracy, that you're not getting the best candidates? Do you think something like this is justified, or do you think that the Supreme Court was right in making sure that affirmative action was no longer put into educational institutions?
So when when you say that we're moving away from a meritocracy, um, are we sure that why does such a system exist where certain people get more on merit than another? So there has to be certain reasons, as because everyone is not going to have the same capability of, let's say, getting the same amount of, let's say, marks. And a person who's gone through a lot of troubles, a lot of phases in their life, or who may not have, let's say, been able to attend a, let's say, private tuition, private coaching, or be able to, like, have access, let's say, have a parent guide them throughout their application process, have different benefits. This can be, let's say, who may, even in teaching, may not have had issues with their teacher. Because if I could just pull out a statistic, it says that around 7% of public school teachers were African American. And if that reflects, the in comparison to the number of students, if a lot of students had the probability of being discriminated against by teachers, there would be a lot of issues, or a certain amount of difficulties they face in getting this higher level marks. And therefore, I do feel that there is, okay, on this is like the tip of the iceberg in the level of hurdles they may face towards achieving the higher grade. So it may not be just a meritocracy argument, because the merit exists because certain people have had advantages, and affirmative action is just a way to level the playing field and ensure that it's not, is it actually an equal society where if a person with the same disadvantage is forced to get the same amount of marks as a person without the disadvantage they face. And that is one uh, point I'd like to put forward.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point actually, because like you'd mentioned, not every community is going to have the same access to education. And what I feel that is very pertinent, and this is especially since this affects us, as I'm applying to the US this very year, in fact, this kind of issue does affect me because I come under the category of Asian American. And what I would feel, and what I've heard a lot of people saying, is that despite the fact that Asians are a minority, they do so well in the country, despite the fact that there may be some systemic oppression, which some people claim. There are some questions which need to be asked, and the way I interpret this is that and why I feel that to some extent affirmative action could be very damning to Asian Americans is the fact that Asian Americans generally come from a culture of culture where studies and education is given high importance. If I were to speak for my case in particular, my parents came to the United States as college students, and their primary focus was to get a good education and to get a good job. Now, if you were to contrast that to immigrants coming from Latin America, they may not have the same amount of skills and the same amount of um, emphasis on education because probably they didn't come from countries where those were given an emphasis, and thus that culture does not exist. And I do think culture has a very big important argument in why Asians do so well. And this has been documented by a variety of people. And in fact, one very great African American scholar, I don't want to reduce him solely to his race, Thomas Sowell, he very much felt that the Black community needed to do more in putting emphasis on education. So the reason why I'm bringing this up, Trish, is that while you'd mentioned that the playing field may not be level, um, at, I do sort of believe that when immigrants come into the country, they also do come from this default playing field where not everybody has the same amount of access, the same amount of privileges, the same amount of familiarity with the country. But if you persevere, and the many success stories show it, people do come out on top, and that's why Asian Americans tend to have the highest incomes in the country. In fact, I think a 2017 statistic, if I'm not wrong, said that Indian Americans made the most money in the U.S. They were the highest earning ethnic group, group by nationality. So that does pose some questions to people saying that the opposition to affirmative action is purely a white supremacist particular claim. It affects a lot of ethnic groups, and it's quite complicated. And I think it's not as simple as a black and white issue like a lot of people make it to be. It's Yeah, it's very multifaceted, and I think we need to be very careful about where we put our eggs in because it's certainly very difficult to assess. Any other thoughts, Trish?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, one statistic I'd like to pull out about Asian Americans was, if I'm not wrong, I think this is also from Pew Research Center, where it states that 61% of adults between the age of 25 and 64 from Asia come with a bachelor's degree.
Yeah,
So, in a way, people from Asia are coming to improve their lives. If a lot of people, I'm not saying all, but a lot of them have come from
yeah, for
order
sure.
to improve their lives. They're perfectly accepted back in their homes if they want to go back, and they have their happy lives at homes. But they decided to improve their opportunity and decided to go into maybe make a name and fame for them outside the country, and perhaps maybe come back or stay there. Who knows? So, in a way, that does put a different concept that are they actually in the same level of issues faced by a person of low income or who's being racially discriminated against within America? Are they facing the same level of issues as someone with a, I mean, is that person facing the same level of issues as someone who's come with a proper bachelor's degree from one of the good colleges within their country and then have migrated to the US for further education?
Yeah, that's a fair point, Trish, actually. And it's good that you raised that statistic. Because in my case, and in probably most of the cases of my friends, and probably most, like you mentioned, 61%, their education, that base definitely does help in sort of guaranteeing more success into the country. And it's not just Indians who do this as well. Taiwanese Americans do very well in the country. Chinese Americans do very well in the country. Filipino Americans do very well. And like you mentioned, immigrants, do you put them on the same playing field? Do you categorize them as the same? And I feel like it can be very redundant if you were to group every immigrant in the same category because and yeah, I think it's a very good point that you've raised, Trish. And I think that only adds to the nuance of the discussion that when we're looking at college admissions, it's and we're looking at affirmative action, whilst the intention is to provide a more even playing field. Is the playing field even in the first place? Like you'd mentioned, and there's so many complexities which go into this issue, and I feel like we're going to be debating on affirmative action for centuries to come if it stays this way. Um, and I very much think we could as well. So yeah, I think that's about it for us. All right, so now we've reached our final and probably most awaited segment of our podcast, and that is on the significance of this affirmative action ruling on the rest of the world, and in particular, India, of course. So whilst we may have all thought that this affirmative action ruling it's rather confined to the US because all this terminology is generally coming out from there, we tend to forget that whilst the term affirmative action is generally used in their context, many robust forms of race-based quotas, or probably not even race, even community-based quotas, rather to provide more equal opportunity, those exist throughout the world. And of course, India is one among the many countries which possesses such a system. So, Trish, given that you are quite knowledgeable on this particular issue, how about you offer your thoughts on what an impact this kind of ruling can have on the rest of the world, and whether India should maybe start taking notes?
Right. So, I think in India, it's the affirmative action is usually through the measure called reservation, where it's broadly classified into four categories. Generally four. There are more, but it's mainly the four ones which are of great importance, right? Which are mainly talked about by the media. So the first one is the SC, which is the scheduled caste. Then you have the ST, which is the scheduled tribe. Then you have the OBC, which is the other backward classes, and then you have the EWS, which are the economically weaker sections. So, I mean, each of them have their distinct reasons as to why they require reservation and why they require affirmative action, because why they are marginalized for reasons which, I mean, they're kind of mentioned in the names as well. So, but I mean, it is usually debated as to why some categories may require, why some categories don't require it. But yeah, that is a debate which people do have, and I mean, I wouldn't want to really put my stake my claim on that, but I would also like to point out like the main criticism is towards I think the SC reservation, where a large people criticize the SC for having it's not based upon say it's not based upon your wealth, but rather than your caste. So if you have a decent income but are from a backward class, you're still entitled to the reservation. And one argument, one rebuttal, which is usually used against this is that people from the SC category do also face certain reservation because of their caste. Not just discrimination is not just because of the income, but it's because of the caste as well. And I do kind of think that this is important because people, I mean, the prejudice against people of lower caste has existed for a long, long time, which is hundreds of years of prejudice. And a country is, after all, it's not even 100 years old, it's just around 80 years. And for such a young country, we're almost like just three generations. I'm sure that such prejudice will still exist, and therefore I feel that there may still be a need for the SC reservation, which I mean it is hotly debated, and I'm sure not many people may agree, but I do think that there needs to be a distinction between that and the EWS as well, because EWS reservation is for those from poorer backgrounds, but SC is also needed for those who are facing from because of their caste. They're being discriminated because of their caste, and I think that until the entire discrimination based on caste goes, which is, I mean, we are improving. I mean, maybe we are slowly moving towards a time without. I mean, we are lesser discrimination towards the towards backward classes, but I mean backward castes, but it hasn't entirely gone yet, and our country is quite young, as I mentioned earlier. So that needs to be taken into account. And what do you think about this out there?
Yeah, that's a fair point, Trish. And my response on this particular the reservation argument, it's quite hotly contested. I don't have a extremely radical point of view, honestly. I'm generally quite neutral towards it. Um, like you mentioned, certain groups, certain castes have been oppressed for millennia. possibly. And to some extent, given that now we are in a democracy, now that we're in a republic, there is some way which we can correct this systemic oppression, and that could be through various ways providing equality of opportunity. That is, after all, the intention, providing more equal platform. But I think, at least from what I've read, and possibly the argument which I've been saying, like you've mentioned, which you just rebutted, given that now India is moving towards a more urbanized society, more people are moving from the villages into cities. And generally, the cities, whilst of course we've been very naive to say that caste based discrimination doesn't exist point blank, um, we definitely could say that there's been progress being made in that front. The argument would be that is it in any way unfair that now you're saying that, like, okay, we want to move towards a casteless society where caste is not, the forefront of the picture, but now you're saying that, okay, we're going to give you a reservation wherein it can be advantageous to you in many ways. Like, for example, universities, the same way in which it's used for colleges in the US. We're going to give you some leeway, which to an extent it may be a bit unfair to those who don't fall in these reserved categories. So that's what I see this argument. Personally, I do think that the reservation is here to stay for a while in India, given that, like you've mentioned, it's a very young country, and certainly the equality of opportunity hasn't been provided to all communities. Um, but the debate is very interesting, and I still would like to educate myself more on it. Um, and one point which I want to add, Trish, before I come to you, is that, and this is another form of affirmative action that I'd been reading, and that's the affirmative action in South Africa. All right. So South Africa, of course, apartheid only was eradicated from the country in 1994, and that's even closer of a date than when reservation was put into the Indian system, or probably even the United States system. And that country, to an extent, has been criticized for probably what people would say is the very harsh forms of affirmative action. For example, we were just reading a particular source from a labor website from the South African from a South African news website from a labor organization, and they had mentioned that if 50 people were to be hired on a board of directors, 35 people had to be of the of African race or other had to be black. So in terms of that, that some people have been saying that that's very unfair, and that even seeps into sports that we enjoy like cricket. So I've been kind of rambling a bit, Trish. So do you have any points of view, first of all, on caste in an urbanized society, and also whether affirmative action is always a good thing?
Uh, right. So, as I have probably might have mentioned this a little earlier here, uh, affirmative action, it could be implemented in different ways, but I feel that there is going to be a need for it as long as we live in a society where there is high levels of inequality. There would be a general need towards affirmative action, but of course the methods which they get implemented will differ, and that can be debated on, and that's for people in positions of power to decide. So as of now, I feel that in the caste-based aspect, as you asked, as long as the titles or there still exists a system of caste where people still think that okay, there is an upper caste, there is a lower caste, people belong to certain segments, then I mean, as I was reading from a book from Ambedkar, The Annihilation of Caste, the Dr. Ambedkar mentions that long there is the name system or the system where uh, people still belong or still classify people into different castes, there is always a risk that if people are moved towards, if people are suddenly given no affirmative action, or people are not really, if the people are just said that you're all equal, there's always a risk that society will revert to a time where the people who bear the names of the upper caste or the more privileged backgrounds will eventually oppress those faced from more marginalized communities. And I do think that that was a really good concern which he had, because that might be quite likely if if affirmative action is suddenly taken away and if the system still prevails. And yeah, and as you mentioned, the South Africa aspect, it may be a bit harder, as you said, because in skin color, it's not really that easy to, let's say, uh, you can't really change your skin color as, let's say, in the caste-based aspect where you can, it's just based upon names. And it's, I mean, maybe a little bit of I believe that until prejudice towards certain communities it slowly dies down, and hateful ideas of certain communities, until that relatively dies down, there would still be requirement for affirmative action, because there's always a risk that you may revert to the time where um, there was high levels of oppression.
Yeah, I think that's well put, Trish. And I could go on actually questioning you, and we could go back and forth on this for a while. But it's probably not gonna do us much good because look at the time. But of course, thank you for your sagacious views, Trish. And once again, I'd like to thank everyone for staying engaged on this most wonderful topic of discussion, that is affirmative action. Of course, it's quite a new ruling, and in terms of the impact which it's going to have, we're still a little bit unsure about it because colleges still have their own autonomy to make their own decisions, and that's what most of the universities are planning to do at the moment. That being said, the ruling does have substance, especially when you're considering the arguments on whether it is morally right to judge people on their race, and whether it's something that it should be done after decades of discrimination in the past. So it's a very thought provoking argument, and I'd like to end it with that. So thank you guys for tuning into this episode of Vox Rationis episode number 3 with Trish Karthik and Aditya Kashyap. Trish, any final words?
Uh, I'd like to thank all of our viewers because we've received such wonderful feedback over the past few weeks. We've received such lovely ways which we can improve, such points which they like about our podcast, and we really hope to incorporate them in our future episodes. And we'd like to maintain the aspects which you all like. So kindly do drop in more feedbacks if you have any, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Over and out.